In the early 9th century, Emperor Michael II sent Louis the Pious an unusual diplomatic gift, a modest little manuscript written in Greek, containing theological works and letters, allegedly composed by Dionysius the Areopagite, who had been converted to Christianity by the Apostle Paul at Athens. After receiving this token from Greek ambassadors in September of 827, Louis immediately sent the manuscript to the Abbey of Saint-Denis, where the bones of Dionysius lay buried. The codex reached the monastery on the 8th of December, 827, the feast day of the saint whose works it contained. The arrival of the book was a momentous event. Abbot Hilduin reported that its presence caused miraculous healings, as though it was a relic. This Greek manuscript soon served as the basis for two Latin translations of the Corpus Dionysiacum, the first by Hilduin and a team of translators sometime between 827 and 834, and the second by John Scotus Eriugena in the late 850s and 860s. The Greek manuscript gifted to Louis the Pious by Michael II underscores two important features of the history of the reception of Greek patristics in the Latin Middle Ages. First, its survival highlights the rarity of Greek texts in the post-Roman West. MS BNF Grec 437 is the only copy of any Eastern patristic writing to survive in its original language in early medieval Europe. This should not surprise us. Given the decline of Greek learning north of the Alps after the dismantling of the Western imperial administration, and with it the state-funded education system that privileged the study of Greek alongside Latin, the number of Greek readers in Western Europe dwindled rapidly from the 5th century onwards. Only a few cultural outposts in Italy and North Africa, with close ties to Constantinople, produced scholars proficient in Greek in the early Middle Ages. Their northern counterparts, like Eriugena, were few and far between. Second, the rapid translation of the Dionysian corpus into Latin, not once but twice in quick succession, speaks to the demand for Eastern Christian learning among Western readers. Indeed, throughout late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, dozens upon dozens of works of Greek patristics were translated into Latin and circulated widely in monastic libraries, where they influenced the devotional and doctrinal thought of generations of Latin-speaking monks. The history of the translation and subsequent influence of Greek patristics in the early medieval West remains to be written. The influence of Greek patristics on Western European thought and culture remains an important but largely overlooked aspect of the history of medieval Latin literature. In this talk, the term patristics is used in the broadest possible sense to embrace all Christian Greek authors writing between the 1st and 8th centuries. Between the 2nd and 13th centuries, Latin translations of the works of almost 100 Christian Greek authors of late antiquity and early Byzantium found their way into the libraries of Western Europe. Evidence for the consumption of Greek patristics among medieval Latin readers is widespread, but with very few exceptions, these texts have not received modern critical editions or translations into English, let alone substantive studies of their readership and impact. This talk brings to light this neglected tradition in medieval Latin literature and draws attention to a new research initiative for the study of these sources, the Lost Patriarchs Project. First, it presents a sample of the deep reservoir of medieval Latin texts with Christian Greek origins and provides evidence for the knowledge and consumption of translated works of Greek patristics among Latin readers in medieval Europe. Second, it considers some of the reasons why translations of Christian Greek works into Latin have thus far eluded scholarly inquiry. And third, it outlines the plans for an instrument of reference tentatively entitled The Lost Patriarchs, a survey of the Greek fathers in the medieval Latin tradition. The translation of Christian Greek texts was a formidable industry in the early Middle Ages that produced dozens upon dozens of Latin works, the impact and influence of which have largely been overlooked by modern scholars. As a corpus, these texts raise a host of fundamental questions. Which of the Greek patriarchs were translated into Latin? Were particular genres of works favored over others? To what degree were these works modified in the process of translation? And how do we proceed with cataloging them to facilitate research? What principles of exclusion do we apply when talking about them as a corpus? Only after we've accomplished this groundwork can we begin to ask more profound questions about their broader significance and investigate in particular whether or not they were consequential in the medieval Latin tradition and in the history of Western Christian doctrine and devotion. The work begins with the manuscripts themselves. Greek remained a language of cultural significance in the Western Roman Empire until the end of the 4th century, and held on tenaciously until the 6th century in cultural outposts along the imperial edge in frequent commerce with Byzantium. It was primarily during this period, when knowledge of Greek waned in the West, that the majority of the surviving translations of the works of Christian Greek authors were rendered into Latin. While there are several tools at our disposal for making sense of these texts as a corpus, many of them have limitations of one kind or another. 20th century research on the reception history of Christian Greek texts in medieval Europe was not abundant. In fact, Albrecht Siegmund's Die Überlieferung der griechischen christlichen Literatur in der lateinischen Kirche bis zum 12. Jahrhundert is the only monographic treatment of this topic written in the modern period. While Siegmund provided a useful starting point for inquiry into this topic, his descriptive catalogue of Greek authors available in Western Europe in Latin translation is both incomplete and now out of date. More recently, the editors of the Clavis Patrum Graecorum have signaled the existence of Latin translations of individual texts written by Greek authors, but the laconic entries of this otherwise indispensable reference work do not begin to elucidate the rich and complex history of the transmission of these texts, the manuscripts in which they resided, and their subsequent influence on Western readers. In the past few decades, individual scholars have drawn repeated attention to the presence of manuscripts containing Latin translations of Christian Greek authors in Western libraries, but there is as yet no comprehensive study of the influence of Eastern patristics in the medieval Latin tradition. Published catalogues of early medieval manuscripts remain extremely useful resources, like the 11 volumes of the Codices Latini Antiquiores and its later addenda, which together provided inventory of all known manuscripts and surviving fragments written before 800 CE. And the 3 hefty tomes comprising Bernard Bishop's directory of 9th century continental manuscripts, excluding those written in Visigothic and Anglo-Saxon. Likewise, a survey of medieval library catalogues and book loan lists reveals the presence of Latin translations of Greek patristics in numerous monastic libraries. Lastly, recent advances in the digital humanities have made hundreds of medieval manuscripts accessible online, opening up the collections of European libraries to public viewing and thereby facilitating research. A preliminary investigation of these resources reveals a treasure trove of Christian Greek texts in Latin, disseminated widely throughout monastic libraries in Northern Europe. These findings fall into 4 broad categories based loosely on genre, keeping in mind that an author may have texts in more than one category, and a category may represent more than one genre. First, Christian doctrine, that is, teachings about the early Christian tradition, including doctrinal discussions hammering out the elements of the faith, sermons, letters of instruction, and homilies on the principles of Christian behavior. Second, Apocrypha, being stories about Christ, Mary, and the apostles modeled on the canonical books of the New Testament, as well as vision literature featuring biblical characters, like the Apocalypse of Paul. Third, works of hagiography, both the Passions of the Martyrs and the Lives of the Saints. And fourth, history, being accounts of the past with an emphasis on God's agency in the unfolding of events. But even these broad categories are not sufficient to encompass all the texts under consideration, which include anonymous collections of proverbial sayings attributed to Greek hermits, the Verba Signorum, and translations of the Acts of Eastern Church councils and decretals. The Abbey of Cluny offers an illuminating case study of the prevalence of Christian Greek literature in Latin translation among medieval monastic readers. Founded in 910 in Burgundy, the monastery of Cluny grew in power and influence over the course of the 10th and 11th century, amassing a library of many hundreds of volumes and producing an abundance of manuscripts that attest to the devotional and intellectual lives of the brethren residing there. According to the Liber Tramitus, an early 11th century Cluniac customary from Farfa, the monks selected books for personal reading at the beginning of the Lenten season. Among the 64 manuscripts distributed to the brethren were several works of Greek origin and Latin guise, including Origen's homilies on Joshua, John Chrysostom's homilies on the Gospel of Matthew, a collection of the sayings of St. Basil, Ephraim the Syrian's treatise on the compunction of the heart, an account of the life of St. Mary of Egypt, and the expansive ancient histories of Josephus and Eusebius. The 12th century library catalog from Cluny supports the impression of the Liber Tramitus that Christian Greek authors in Latin translation made up a sizable portion of their manuscript holdings. While many catalog entries show the influence of major Eastern authors of Christian doctrine like Gregory Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, and Ephraim the Syrian, The monks of Cluny also copied and read Greek works of salvation history and the decrees of Eastern church councils in Latin translation. While the evidence for the presence of Latin renderings of Greek patristic texts at Cluny and other medieval abbeys is clear in the surviving manuscripts and library catalogues, the influence of this devotional and historical literature on Western medieval thought remains unstudied, in no small part because very little work has been done on the textual traditions and receptions of Christian Greek authors in the West. So why has modern scholarship ignored this important tradition in Latin literature for so long? Our blind spots concerning Latin translations of Eastern patristics are deeply rooted in prejudices dating back to the 16th century. Our preference for original Greek texts over medieval Latin renderings of them is a regrettable legacy of Renaissance humanism, the essential feature of which was the possibility of a return to the original Greek. But the problem is even larger than this. The lack of scholarly interest in Latin translations of Christian Greek materials is also bound up in their subject matter. Most of these texts are theological and exegetical in content. Their neglect is related to a general disregard in Anglophone scholarship and to a lesser degree in Europe for what we would call the intellectual history of late antiquity. Moreover, scholars generally hold that the most important transmissions from Greek into Latin occurred not in late antiquity, but in the context of the later Middle Ages, especially during the so-called Renaissance of the 12th century. It was during this period that many works were translated from Arabic into Latin, explicitly to recover works of ancient Greek medicine and philosophy that were unknown in the Western tradition. The attention given to these translation enterprises privileges the types of knowledge important to modern audiences, philosophy and medicine, at the expense of religious texts, theological treatises, polemics, homilies, and exegesis, which were arguably as important, if not more important, to medieval readers. When scholars do concern themselves with these texts, the questions asked of them often do not concern their reception history, but rather their significance to their contemporary authors and audiences. To study Eastern patristic works surviving in Latin translation, scholars must shift the course of inquiry away from the original author's thoughts and contexts, and toward the cultural and intellectual histories of the Western medieval reading communities who read the Latin renderings of these works. A related problem is our tendency to favor authentic sources from the Middle Ages to the exclusions of works of bricolage like epitomes, florilegia, and compendia, which are bountiful in medieval manuscripts, and of texts translated from other languages into medieval Latin, of which there are no small number. Tatian's Diatessaron, a popular recasting of the four Gospels into a single narrative, is a noteworthy example. Originally written in Syriac or Greek around 160 to 175 CE, the Diatessaron survives only in Latin and Arabic translations from the early Middle Ages. The Latin translation was widely read in monastic communities throughout Western Europe. For linguistic scholars, the Latin Diatessaron plays a pivotal role in understanding early medieval gospel harmonies in Old High German and Old Saxon. Despite its importance, no critical edition or translation of this work has ever appeared. We can attribute the general neglect of Tatian's gospel harmony to its length. The Diatessaron is about the size of 3 Gospels combined. But the ambiguity surrounding its textual identity is clearly also an issue. Written by a 2nd century author, yet extant as the cultural product of an early medieval Latin translator, the Diatessaron defies easy categorization. Fortunately, a new generation of scholars is casting off these old prejudices and drawing attention to the wealth of evidence for the influence of Christian Greek literature in the Western Latin tradition. The reception of Greek hagiographic texts in Latin translation has proven to be an especially fruitful avenue of research, which reflects the recent popularity of saints' lives as sources for medieval history. For example, Carmela Franklin has investigated the reception history of the life of Anastasius the Persian, a Sasanian soldier who's converted to Christianity in 628 and suffered martyrdom in Caesarea. Originally written in Greek, the account of Anastasius' suffering and death underwent considerable transformation in the 7th century and thereafter when Latin authors translated it for Western audiences. More recently, Maya Mascarenhas has deployed the Latin vitae of Eastern saints in her examination of late antique holy men and women who were venerated in Rome between the 6th and 9th centuries, successfully wedding the evidence of saints' lives with insights gleaned from archaeology and epigraphy. The study of hagiography of Greek origin in Latin translation is hindered, however, by a dearth of modern critical editions and translations of this vast corpus of texts, many of which languish unedited and unread in the obscurity of early modern compendia of saints' lives. New editions of the Latin translations of Anastasius' Life of Antony, published in the series Corpus Christianorum Series Latina, show the way forward as do recent translations of early Greek and Latin martyr narratives by Eric Rebiard and Michael Lappage. The study of the reception of Greek Christian Apocrypha is as rich and vibrant as the study of hagiography. Established in the popular imagination by the industry of M.R. James, who translated many popular legends about Jesus, Mary, the Apostles, and the Old Testament patriarchs into English in the early 20th century, this field of research has been an enduring source of fascination for scholars and the general public alike. Fostered by academic organizations like the North American Society for the Study of Christian Apocryphal Literature, scholars have worked diligently to bring to light Latin renderings of late ancient Greek extra-canonical texts and to chart the influence of these texts in Western medieval devotional practices. Marie-Therese Doller's recent translation and commentary of the Acts of the Apostle Peter, the Acta Petri, is a model study that provides access and insight into this influential story about the battle between the Apostle Peter and his adversary, Simon Magus. Meanwhile, scholars of early medieval England have led the way in determining and delineating the impact of apocryphal texts on the preaching strategies and devotional practices of the Anglo-Saxons. While this attention to saints' lives and biblical apocrypha serves to advance research on the reception of Latin works of Greek origin in Western Europe, much more work remains to be done on the most prevalent and yet almost completely neglected corpus of Christian Greek texts in Latin translation, patristics. A new initiative, the Lost Patriarchs Project, aims to cast light on this overlooked yet influential tradition of medieval Latin literature. The goal of the Lost Patriarchs Project is the production of a collaborative multi-volume instrument of reference called the Lost Patriarchs, a survey of the Greek fathers in the medieval Latin tradition. The aim of this work is to further the study of the transmission and reception of Greek patristics in medieval Europe. The book will present a catalog of the deep, largely untouched reservoir of medieval Latin texts that have Christian Greek origins, both those known directly from surviving manuscript copies and those known only indirectly from medieval library catalogs. As the word survey suggests, this will not be a typical academic monograph, but rather a research tool modeled on Text and Transmission, a survey of the Latin classics, edited by L.D. Reynolds in 1983. That is, an alphabetically arranged handbook that presents a series of concise accounts of the manuscript tradition and transmission of Greek Christian literature in the medieval Latin tradition. A reference tool of this kind would gather all that is known about these texts in current scholarship, allowing future researchers to begin the work of creating critical editions of them and incorporating them into our understanding of medieval thought. The sheer bulk of primary source material available for study, doctrinal and polemical works, devotional and aesthetic literature, homilies, apocrypha, hagiography, history, and more, requires the application of principles of exclusion to keep the work manageable. At the outset, the project will focus exclusively on the works of named Greek authors active from the 1st to the 8th centuries, whose work survives in Latin translation, ranging from popular figures like John Chrysostom, Ephraim the Syrian, Gregory Nazianzus, and Basil of Caesarea, to the most obscure. It will also include the ecclesiastical historians of the 4th and 5th centuries. For pragmatic reasons, the project will not treat the genres of hagiography and apocryphal literature. There are many examples of Greek saints' lives and apocrypha in the Latin tradition, as we've seen, but the abundance of sources and the complexity of their reception histories demand independent studies. Likewise, the project will not cover anonymous Christian works like the didactic series of moralizing animal tales known as Physiologos, nor will it examine the reception of the translation of the Acts of Eastern Church councils, except when those acts serve as the medium for the transmission of excerpts of Greek patristic texts into the West. The Lost Patriarchs Project will develop over the course of the next decade in 3 distinct phases. In phase 1, the editor will conduct the research necessary to give the project a firm foundation, and I'm happy to report at this time that the project has now been funded for a year by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So this will include charting the parameters of the survey with the aid of instruments of reference, like Sigmund and the Clavis Patrum Graecorum, and digital manuscripts, compiling the alphabetical table of contents of the 90 or so Greek authors and their works to be included in the survey, composing 4 to 6 sample entries to serve as models for contributors, drawing attention to the project through international presentations like this one and publications, and soliciting contributors to write entries in their areas of expertise. In phase 2, the editor will continue the research agenda outlined in phase 1, while also organizing international conferences to publicize the project and its contribution to the widest possible audiences, and to provide venues for contributors to share the progress of their work. Phase 3 will involve the preparation of the contributions for publication with an internationally recognized press that specializes in medieval studies. Needless to say, a project of this magnitude demands international collaboration. The purpose of this introduction to the Lost Patriarchs Project is to spread word about the project to the largest possible audience of specialists on Greek patristic writings and their reception, and to solicit the participation of scholars and their students who would like to contribute their expertise to the publication. For more information about the future of the project, the editorial team, and how to take part, please visit the Lost Patriarchs Project website, www.lostpatriarchsproject.com. Thank you very much.